They say the frontier remembers every footstep, every sin, every bullet that ever cracked open the quiet air. And on a wind-pushed evening in the late 1800s, when the skies burned red over the dry bones of Red Butte Valley, two strangers rode into town like ghosts returning to a forgotten grave. Jonah Creed, thin, silver-haired, coat frayed from long miles, sat tall in his saddle despite the weight of years. Beside him rode Mara, a woman whose gentleness could soften even the desert wind, her blue shawl fluttering as if it refused to bow to the harsh frontier. Red Butte was the kind of place the railroad forgot. A few crooked storefronts, a saloon with a roof that sighed when the wind leaned on it, a sheriff older than the jail he slept in. Nothing ever arrived in Red Butte except dust, silence, and travelers who didn't plan to stay. Trouble rarely stopped there, but trouble has a way of smelling weakness or imagining it. Jonah halted near the saloon hitching post. Mara climbed down gracefully, brushing dust from her skirt while Jonah tied the reins loosely, letting the horses ease their tired bodies. A few men on the porch watched them with the lazy hunger of men who had nothing to do and too many hours to fill. Their eyes lingered on Mara longer than they should have. Then one man stepped forward. Clay Murdoch. 23, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, and mean in the way young men get when the world has never dared push back. His boots hit the saloon steps with a thud as he strutted into the open, chest puffed, eyes narrowed in the kind of cruelty that hadn't yet learned consequence. "Well, look here," Clay called, loud enough to wake every ghost in the valley. "Old Drifter brings his pretty lady into our town, didn't know we started talkin' in fossils and their grandmamas." Jonah didn't react, not a blink, not a twitch of the jaw, he simply rested a hand on Mara's shoulder. Clay saw stillness and mistook it for fear. Most fools did. "Tell me, old man," Clay went on, grinning with all his teeth, "your wife always trail after you, or did you buy her off a wagon train?" Laughter cracked like dry branches across the porch. Mara lowered her eyes, a flush creeping across her cheeks. Jonah lifted his gaze slowly and something cold flickered there, not anger, not pride, just a warning from a man who had seen storms far darker than boys like Clay Murdoch. "Son," Jonah said softly, "keep your tongue holstered, you're pointing it at the wrong place." Clay stepped forward, breath sour with whiskey, leaning close enough that Mara tensed. "Or what?" he sneered. "You gonna gum me to death? I'd snap you in half without trying." Mara tugged Jonah's sleeve. "Please, let's go." But Clay needed an audience more than air. He wanted Jonah small, he wanted Mara shaken. That was the meal a bully fed on. With a sudden slap, Clay knocked Jonah's hat off his head. Silence smothered the street, even the wind paused. Jonah crouched slowly, picked up the hat and brushed it clean with the same care he might have given a wounded bird. When he rose, something in his posture made even the porch drunks shift uneasily. He wasn't glaring, he wasn't bristling, he was simply calm, too calm. "Enjoy your evening," Jonah said, fitting the hat back into place. "But be careful who you provoke, some storms don't give warnings." He touched Mara's elbow and guided her toward the boarding house, leaving Clay standing in a puddle of his own pride. Clay spat into the dirt, frustration twitching in his shoulders. "Old man's got no bite," he muttered. But not everyone agreed. A ranch hand at the water trough leaned toward his companion and spoke so softly only the wind carried the truth. "That ain't just an old man." Twilight sank deeper, thickening the shadows between buildings, and the whisper grew legs in the dark. Travelers swore they could feel the air change after Jonah passed, like the desert had recognized him, like it had once known the tread of his boots. Rumors drifted like smoke, the way he held himself, the steadiness of his hands, the silence of a man who carried a past he'd never confess. Mara felt it too as they climbed the stairs to their rented room. Jonah walked ahead of her, shoulders set, jaw thoughtful. When he looked at her, he tried to soften it, but something old and watchful still lingered in his eyes. "You didn't deserve that," he murmured. "Neither did you," she replied. But Jonah said nothing more. Men who'd lived difficult lives rarely wasted words. Outside, Clay paced the saloon porch, wounded pride swelling with each step. His friends egged him on, taunting him for letting an old ghost embarrass him in front of half the town. Clay's anger fermented into something sour and reckless. "No one makes a fool out of me," he growled. "Midnight, I'll show Red Butte who really runs this place." The wind picked up again, carrying grit and the scent of a coming storm. Lanterns flickered in windows as the town settled into uneasy stillness. The sheriff shut his door early, sensing trouble he didn't have the strength to stop. The horses in the livery shifted nervously, hooves scraping wooden stalls. And Jonah Creed stood at the window of the small upstairs room, watching the horizon darken. Mara touched his arm, feeling tension coiled beneath his skin like a sleeping rattler. "Jonah, are we in danger?" she whispered. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the street below, on the shadows that crawled across the dirt like gathering spirits. "Not yet," he said, "but there's a storm coming." Mara swallowed hard, because of Clay. No, Jonah finally turned, and in the lantern light she saw the truth. He wasn't afraid of Clay Murdoch at all, because boys like him don't understand the weight of the men they provoke. His voice was not the voice of a harmless drifter, it was colder, older, sharper. And as the last glow of sunset bled away, Red Butte found itself holding its breath, sensing long before the truth was spoken that a legend had just stepped quietly into its midst. Evening settled over Red Butte with a strange heaviness, as though the sky itself sensed the trouble creeping back toward town. Jonah and Mara were finishing up at the livery, brushing dust from the horses' coats and speaking softly to keep their nerves still. The wind had begun to shift, carrying the scent of rain and something sharper, the electric tension that rides ahead of a frontier storm. Mara glanced at the darkening horizon. Jonah noticed the worry in her eyes and touched her hand gently, offering a small smile meant to steady her. But steadiness was a fleeting gift. The harsh clatter of hooves shattered the quiet. 4 riders approached, silhouettes jagged against the rising storm clouds. Jonah didn't need to turn, he felt it in the tightening of the air behind him. Clay Murdoch had returned, and he hadn't come alone. Clay swung off his horse with the swagger of a man who believed the town belonged to him. His 3 outlaws followed, each more ragged, drunk, and dangerous than the last. Clay pointed at Jonah with a smirk, twisting his lips. "Thought you could walk away from me, old man," he shouted. "Red Butte answers to us, every inch of it." One outlaw shoved Jonah hard enough to make most men stumble. Jonah didn't. He only took half a step back, steady as a rooted tree. The second outlaw leaned toward Mara and spat into the dirt beside her boot, eyes gleaming with cruelty as he sized her up like stolen property. "Stay behind me," Jonah murmured, and though the words were soft, his voice carried a new edge, controlled, cold, deliberate. Mara obeyed instinctively, feeling a shift in him she couldn't name, something coiled like a rattlesnake waiting to strike. Clay circled them slowly, his boots grinding into the dirt. "Look at him, boys, old-timers gettin' protective, must think he's still got some fire left in those shaky bones." His men snorted and laughed, feeding off his swagger. Thunder rumbled overhead, low and distant, as the storm crawled closer. One outlaw reached out and grabbed Mara's arm, tugging her forward. "Why don't you come with us?" he taunted. "We'll show you a finer time than this grandpa ever could." Jonah's gaze lifted, a hard glint slicing through the shadows. "Let her go," he said. "I won't warn you again." Clay threw his head back, laughing. "Aw, listen to him, old man's pretending to be dangerous. What are you gonna do, trip on your own boots tryin' to fight us?" The others laughed with him, until Mara cried out. The outlaw tugged harder, trying to drag her away. Jonah took one step forward, then another, moving with measured precision that made Clay falter for a blink. Jonah's shoulders were loose, but his eyes were shards of winter ice. "I said," Jonah repeated, "let her go." "Or what?" the outlaw snapped, jerking Mara again. "You gonna break a hip tryin' to save her?" Clay stepped up behind Jonah, shoved him between the shoulder blades and spat near Mara's boot again. "Town belongs to us, and that means everything in it." Lightning split the sky in a white, tearing flash. The outlaw still had Mara's wrist. Clay still had his smirk. And Jonah still had his restraint. Until Clay made the mistake no man should ever make. He struck Mara across the face. Her gasp cracked through the storm-waiting air, soft but devastating. Her body recoiled, shawl slipping from her shoulders, the red mark blooming on her cheek like a cruel brand. Jonah froze. In that breathless moment, it seemed the entire valley paused with him. Even the wind dared not move. His eyes lifted slowly, and in them was something ancient, something forged long before Red Butte, long before Mara, long before Clay Murdoch had ever drawn breath. A ghost of a life buried deep but not dead. Clay stepped back, unease flickering across his young features. What are you starin' at?" Jonah moved. He wasn't fast in the frantic, wild way boys fight. He was fast in the terrifying way men become after a lifetime of violence. His hand clamped around the wrist holding Mara, twisting it with practiced precision. The outlaw screamed and dropped to his knees as Jonah released Mara and gently pushed her behind him. Another outlaw lunged, swinging a fist at Jonah's head. Jonah swayed aside with the ease of a man dodging a falling leaf. His elbow snapped forward, connecting with the outlaw's forearm. A pop, a cry, and the man stumbled back, clutching his wrist as the gun slipped from his fingers. The third outlaw charged, but Jonah stepped into him, grabbing his shirt collar and redirected his momentum, sending him crashing into the barn wall. Dust rained down from the rafters. Clay scrambled backward, stunned by the suddenness of it all. His earlier bravado drained from him like water spilling into sand. You ain't normal," he stammered. "You ain't just some drifter." Jonah didn't answer, he didn't even breathe hard, but his shoulders trembled not from fear but from the effort of pulling himself back from the edge of something far darker. Clay saw that tremble and mistook it for weakness. "Look at him," Clay barked, desperately trying to regain the upper hand. "His bones are rattlin' already, old man's gonna fall apart if we push him any harder." Jonah's fists slowly unclenched as if he were fighting himself more than them. Mara reached for him, her voice a fragile whisper. "Jonah, please." But Clay wasn't finished. Pride makes fools bold. "Get him," he yelled. An outlaw went for his gun. Jonah moved again, this time faster, sharper. His hand shot out, striking the outlaw's wrist. The gun fired harmlessly into the dirt. Jonah grabbed the man by the shirt, pulled him forward and drove him to the ground. He didn't break bones, he didn't snap necks. He chose every strike with restraint, forcing control where instinct demanded something lethal. Clay watched in disbelief, face paling. "What are you?" he whispered. Jonah still didn't answer. And that silence scared Clay more than any threat could. He backed toward his horse, rage battling terror in his young eyes. "This ain't over," he spat. "You hear me? This ain't over. Midnight we're comin' back, all of us, and we're gonna finish the job." He mounted his horse and rode off, his gang scrambling to follow despite their bruises and twisted limbs. Their silhouettes disappeared into the storm-dark horizon. Only then did Jonah's shoulders sag. Mara touched his arm, trembling. "Jonah, what did you just do?" He looked at her with a sorrow deeper than the desert night. "I held back," he said quietly, "more than you know." Thunder boomed overhead as the storm rolled closer. Lanterns flickered across town, shutters slammed shut, and Red Butte seemed to curl in on itself like a creature sensing danger. Jonah stared into the gathering darkness, jaw clenched tight. Midnight was coming. And whatever he had been once, whatever Clay had awakened, would have no choice but to rise again. Night seeped into Red Butte like ink spilled across parchment, thick and dark and full of unspoken fear. The storm that had threatened earlier now brooded on the horizon, lightning flickering in the far distance like restless spirits packing the hills. Inside their small rented room above the livery, Jonah Creed sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight too old to name. Mara stood before him, her cheeks still faintly bruised, her eyes searching his face for answers he had long kept hidden. "Jonah," she whispered, voice trembling, "what happened back there? How did you move like that? Who are you really?" Jonah didn't look at her at first. His hands rested on his knees, fingers clasped tight, knuckles pale beneath worn skin. The lamp beside them cast a warm glow across his weathered features, illuminating shadows that had lived there far longer than she had known him. "I promised myself I'd never tell you," he finally said, voice low, almost ashamed. "Because the man I used to be, he doesn't deserve you, he doesn't deserve peace, and I thought if I kept him buried, maybe he'd stay gone." "Jonah," Mara said gently, taking a step closer, "you can tell me anything." He lifted his gaze then, and in the lamplight his eyes glimmered with secrets long buried beneath dust and silence. "Before you met me on that road near Cimarron Creek, before I ever learned what it felt like to sit by a fire without expecting gunfire, I hunted men." She flinched, not in fear but in surprise. Jonah watched her closely, bracing for rejection, but Mara's steady gaze urged him on. "I wasn't a bounty hunter," he continued. "Not one of those men who chase posters for coin. No, I worked for the government, quietly, off the books. They called us ghost trackers, a handful of men chosen to hunt the worst killers in the territories, the kind of outlaws whose names were spoken only in whispers, whose cruelty left towns empty and trails stained red. Mara's breath caught. Ghost Tracker, I've heard that name. Her hand drifted to her heart. I thought it was just a story, a legend. Jonah shook his head. There were no legends, only men who were trained to find death before it found others. His voice hushed into something broken. I was good at it, Mara, too good. I learned how to read tracks a day old, how to slip through darkness without being heard, how to end a fight before the other man could breathe. It hollowed me out piece by piece. He glanced toward the window where thunder muttered in the distance. Then one day I stood over a man I'd been hunting for 2 months. He was unarmed, hurt, lost, and I saw myself in him, not who I was but who I was becoming. That night I walked away, I left the trackers, I left everything. Until you found me, I didn't think I deserved to be saved. Mara moved to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. You are not that man anymore. Jonah's eyes softened with aching gratitude. I tried, Mara, I truly did, but Clay and his boys, they've dragged that ghost out of the grave, and if I don't become him again, even for one night, then you won't live to see another dawn. Fear flickered in her expression. Jonah, you don't have to. Yes, he interrupted softly, I do. He stood, lifting his coat from the chair, and the weight of it seemed to settle his resolve. Mara watched as he buckled a leather strap around his thigh, securing a knife he hadn't touched in years. He strapped on a second holster, one she didn't even know he owned. His movements were deliberate, ritualistic, like a man donning old armor he hoped never to wear again. I'm not going to kill them, Jonah said, not unless they force my hand, but I need to make sure they never come near you again. Mara stepped close, touching his cheek. I trust you, but I'm scared. Jonah pressed his forehead to hers. So am I. Outside, the air thickened with the scent of coming rain. Jonah slipped into the night like a shadow returning to familiar ground. He moved through the outskirts of town with a precision bordering on silence, weaving thin wires between fence posts, scattering broken glass beneath pockets of brush, rigging lanterns in ways that bent light and tricked the eyes. Every motion revealed who he had once been, the man called a ghost because outlaws swore he moved like one. Townsfolk peeked from behind shuttered windows as he passed, whispers slipping into the dark. That's him, I'm sure of it. He walks like he's tracking death. I heard stories of a man like that, the one who hunted killers for sport. No stories say he retired, they say he disappeared. Maybe he's back. Jonah climbed the low ridge overlooking Red Butte, settling among boulders with a vantage that watched every road into town. His silhouette melded into the darkness, only the faint glint of his eyes betraying life. Below, the night deepened, Red Butte held its breath. Mara stood at their window, hands clasped as she scanned the shadows, praying the man she loved would return home safe, and that the man he used to be would not claim him entirely. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of distant hooves. 4 riders. Then 6. Then more. They were laughing, drunk, overconfident, hollering threats into the wind as if the world owed them victory. Clay's voice rose above the others, loud and vicious. Midnight, old man, you better be shaking in those boots of yours. We're coming for you and your woman both. Lightning cracked open the sky, illuminating their figures briefly, bent forward in their saddles, guns swaying, faces lit with twisted anticipation. Jonah watched from the ridge, calm as a blade cooling after the forge. The time for burying ghosts had passed. Midnight had come. And with it, the reckoning Jonah Creed had tried his whole life to leave behind. Midnight draped itself over Red Butte like a burial cloth, the streets empty, the windows shuttered, the lanterns burning low as if afraid to cast light on what was coming. Wind whistled between buildings, stirring dust into small restless spirals. The storm still lingered on the horizon, muttering its anger in distant thunder. Jonah Creed stood perfectly still on the ridge overlooking town, his silhouette blending into the rocks, watching, listening, waiting. The outlaws came in loud. Clay led the charge, hollering curses that cracked through the night air. Behind him rode 6 men, drunk, furious, and confident in their numbers. Their hooves pounded the earth like war drums, echoing off clapboard walls as they barreled into the center of town. Come out, old man, Clay shouted. We're finishing this tonight. Jonah did not answer, silence was his ally. The outlaws spread out, squinting into shadows. A lantern swung in the wind, throwing broken patches of light across the street. One outlaw stepped toward the alley beside the saloon, right into the thin wire Jonah had stretched earlier. His boot caught and he pitched forward with a startled cry. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, his gun skittering away into the dark. The men jerked around. What was that? Ghosts in this town or what? But Clay tried to steady them, waving his pistol wildly. "It's just the old man, find him." Another outlaw edged closer to the livery, gun raised. Jonah watched him from the shadows atop the ridge, waiting for the moment the man lifted his weapon too high. Then Jonah squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like lightning, short, sharp, decisive. The bullet struck the iron lantern pole beside the outlaw, ricocheting with perfect precision. The metal sang. The outlaw screamed as the rebounding shot ripped the gun clean from his hand, sending it spinning across the dirt. Chaos erupted. Clay stumbled backward, eyes wide with disbelief. "This ain't possible," he muttered, breath shaking. "He's just an old man." But no one around him believed that anymore. A shape separated itself from the darkness at the far end of the street, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Jonah Creed stepped forward, coat stirring gently in the wind, his face half-lit by the flickering lantern glow. He moved like something both human and myth, a man carved from shadow and fire, steady as if he had walked this road in 100 different lifetimes. The outlaws froze. Clay swallowed hard, his bravado faltered. "No, you ain't him," he whispered. "You can't be." Jonah's eyes held no anger, only a tired resolve. "Leave this town," he said quietly. "Leave now and you'll see the sunrise." Clay's breath hitched at the calmness in Jonah's voice, calmness that carried a promise far heavier than rage. But pride is a noose young men fashion for themselves. Clay shoved one of his own men aside and stepped forward, raising his pistol with shaking hands. "You don't scare me," he shouted, though every tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're just a washed-up drifter. I'll show them you ain't nothin'." Jonah didn't move, his stillness seemed to swallow the night. Clay fired. The bullet whistled past Jonah's arm, kicking dust behind him. Clay fired again, too fast, too wild, blinking sweat from his eyes. The third shot shattered a window, showering glass into the street. Jonah lifted his weapon. One shot. Clay staggered as if the earth had tilted beneath him. His pistol dropped from his hand, clattering uselessly at his feet. A thin line of blood trickled down his arm where Jonah's bullet had grazed him, intentional, controlled, merciful. Clay's knees buckled and he collapsed in the center of the street, sobbing with shock and humiliation. "Why didn't you kill me?" he choked out. Why spare me?" Jonah holstered his gun with deliberate calm. "Because the West doesn't need more dead boys," he said softly. "It needs men wise enough to learn when they've crossed a line." Clay stared up at him, trembling, the truth settling into his bones like winter frost. He had provoked a man so far beyond his understanding that survival felt like a mercy he didn't deserve. His outlaws fled first, bolting into the night like frightened deer. Clay followed moments later, stumbling, clutching his wounded arm, but alive. The storm cracked open above them, rain beginning to fall as if washing away the violence from the dirt. Jonah stood alone in the street as the storm finally broke, rain pattering against the rooftops, hissing against the dust. Slowly, doors creaked open. Townsfolk emerged, lanterns in hand, staring at the man who had single-handedly saved Red Butte from a night of slaughter. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Mara ran to Jonah, relief flooding her features. She wrapped her arms around him and he held her close, breathing in the scent of rain and safety, letting the tension drain from him like poison. The sheriff stepped forward, hat in hand. "Reckon we owe you," he murmured. "Didn't know we had a legend sittin' quiet among us." Jonah shook his head. "I ain't a legend," he said, "just a man who's tired of fightin'. But legends seldom get to choose." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving Red Butte washed clean in golden morning light. Jonah and Mara saddled their horses as townsfolk watched from porches and windows, whispering stories that would travel faster than any bullet. Some claimed Jonah Creed walked like a ghost because he had lived through death too many times. Others swore his aim was supernatural, blessed or cursed depending on who told the tale. Children would grow up hearing of the night one man stood against an army and never flinched. Jonah tightened the strap on his saddle, then helped Mara onto hers. She smiled down at him, her eyes full of quiet pride. "Where will we go?" she asked. He mounted his horse beside her, gazing toward the open road. "Someplace peaceful," he said, "someplace no one knows my name." But even as he spoke, the wind seemed to carry whispers of it. Jonah Creed. the ghost tracker who returned for one final night. As they rode out of Red Butte, the sunrise painted their silhouettes across the valley floor, two figures moving steadily toward a horizon that had long waited to claim them. And behind them, in the hearts of everyone who witnessed that midnight reckoning, a legend was born that would outlive all who breathed it. Jonah never looked back, he didn't need to. The West would remember him long after the dust settled.